A good Erev Shabbos. With one small gesture, like putting up a mezuzah on our door, we acknowledge God as creator of all life and redeemer of Israel, and in some small measure, fulfill our purpose on earth. So when people ask, what's it all about? You can tell them it's the small things that add up to a full and good life. Every act of giving tzedakah, each kind word, welcoming a stranger, each blessing over Shabbos candles or Kiddush, each Yehei Shmei Rabbah. Our parsha this week, our Torah portion, Parshas Bo, contains 20 mitzvot, which is more than we've had in our entire Torah reading thus far. According to some, we've only learned 3 mitzvahs since we began our annual Torah reading on Simchas Torah. We had the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply, the prohibition of eating the sciatic nerve, and bris milah. Others say we've had a dozen or so mitzvot so far. In any case, they begin in abundance in this week's parsha. In 2 weeks, we'll have the world-famous 10 Commandments, and the weeks to follow, dozens of mitzvot in each weekly portion. We start this week with the mitzvahs of the Paschal offering, the Korban Pesach, the Passover lamb. It's a central focus of the Seder, which we'll be celebrating, hopefully in good health and hopefully together, just a few months away. It takes a very central place in our celebration, particularly considering that it's not even there. The parable we discussed in years past would be if you wanted to commemorate outstanding corned beef or pastrami sandwich that you had at your favorite deli, a delicious pile of flesh almost falling off the bread. So in commemoration, you got the rye bread or the onion roll or whatever your pleasure is. You put a little mustard and maybe some Russian dressing on the bread and a pickle and some coleslaw on the side, but no corned beef. How much of a remembrance would that be? It would leave me sadder than ever, maybe. And yet that's just what we do at the Seder with the Hillel sandwich, the korech. We take matzah and bitter herb and we say, this is what Hillel used to do in temple times. He ate the Pesach, the roasted lamb, with bitter herb on matzah, and we eat our little remembrance of the Korban Pesach just without the meat. It's quite possibly the strangest vegetarian moment in the Jewish calendar. This mitzvah of Korban Pesach, though, is central to the Seder, central to the holiday, and really central to who we are as Jews, because it defines us as followers of the God who created us and everything else, and it distinguishes us from the idolaters of Egypt, who worship many things as deities, among them the ram. In essence, we're showing the Egyptians that we can eat their God for dinner. It's a pretty powerful statement if you view it in that light. Listen to the Sefer HaChinuch on the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. Sefer HaChinuch is an anonymous compiler of the 613 mitzvot, organized by Parsha, so you can see which mitzvot are derived from which Torah portions. He lived in Spain in the 1200s, roughly Maimonides' times, and he's writing about one somewhat curious part of the mitzvah. Among other details, the Torah instructs us about the Korban Pesach, etzem lo yisishberu vo. When you eat the Pesach, don't crack the bones. So the Chinuch explains, quote, at the root of this mitzvah lies the purpose to have us remember the miracles of Egypt, for it's not a way of honor for royal princes to scrape the bones and break them. Therefore, at the beginning of our emergence to become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, and again, every year at the same time, it's fitting for us to do mitzvot, which reflect the great degree of excellence to which we rose at that time. Through our actions and its representation, we imprint this matter on our souls forever. He continues, know that we are influenced in accordance with our actions. Our hearts and thoughts are always drawn after the deeds with which we occupy ourselves, whether good or bad. Thus, even a person who is thoroughly wicked, if that person will arouse their spirit and set their striving in Torah and mitzvahs, even not for the sake of heaven, they will veer toward the good. And with the power of their own good deeds, they will deaden the evil impulse, because our hearts are drawn after our acts. And the reverse is also true. If a person is thoroughly righteous, their heart upright and honest, desiring Torah and mitzvahs, but they engage constantly in impure matters, for example, they were appointed to an evil vocation, then at some point they will turn away from righteousness. In this vein, the sages of blessed memory said at the end of tractate Makot, Ratza HaKadosh Baruch Hu lezakos es Yisrael. The omnipresent God desired to make the Jewish people meritorious. Lefikach hirba behem Torah u'mitzvot. Therefore, he gave them an ample Torah and mitzvahs in abundance in order to be able to fasten all our thoughts onto them. That all of our preoccupation should be with them. In Tractate Menachos, the sages say, one who has a mezuzah at the doorway, tzitzis on the corners of the garments, and tefillin on the head, will be assured that he will not sin. These are constant mitzvot. One is constantly affected by them. And the chinuch continues further, therefore look carefully to what your work and your occupation are, for you will be drawn after them. And now that you are aware of this, you should not find it hard to understand the multiplicity of precepts in connection with remembering the miracle of leaving Egypt, for they are a major pillar in our Torah. For as we become increasingly occupied with them, so are we affected by the matter. He concludes this section of the prohibition of breaking the bones by noting that it applies to both men and women. Earlier in this conversation, the Sefer HaChinuch noted that the Pesach is to be roasted and not boiled because that's the way royalty eats meat. The lower classes usually cannot afford such outstanding dishes. When they can, they must boil or bake it to get every bit of taste and nutrition out of it. And other details, such as there are to be no leftovers, it's a one-time banquet. The thing about the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering, is that it's accomplishing a number of things on different levels at the same time. One thing is it's encouraging us to change our view of ourselves. We were lowly, we were enslaved, captive to another nation. We had what the Torah calls kotzer ruach, shortness of breath, quite literally, or as some explain it, a weak imagination, inability to see that things could be different. Korban Pesach is like that old show, Queen for a Day. If you eat the food that kings eat in the way that kings eat it, prepared as kings have it prepared for them, without leaving leftovers or cracking the bones, perhaps you're not lowly, servile people after all. Perhaps you're a special, chosen nation. Maybe you yourself are actually royalty. To emphasize that point, we say in the Haggadah that God took goy mikerev goy, one nation out of another nation, took us, the Jewish people, out of Egypt, out of the Egyptian nation. We were quite accustomed to life in Egypt in many ways, so much so that it was hard for us to see ourselves any other way. To highlight the difference, the Korban Pesach makes a black and white distinction. Couldn't be more a higher contrast between the Hebrew nation and the Egyptians. Egypt, as we mentioned, was a polytheistic nation. The Pharaoh was a god, the Nile River was a god, the sun god Ra had a ram's head. So for Jews to take a ram, a representative of their polytheism, and keep it for 4 days before then slaughtering it, daubing its blood on our doorposts and eating it, makes a very strong statement about that polytheism. Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, the Rav of Königsberg, which is now called Kaliningrad, he was the Rav in the 1800s, early 1800s. He writes that in those days it was a capital offense in Egypt to harm even the smallest part of a lamb or a sheep. So all of a sudden, everything's turned upside down. The Jews are taking the choicest sheep from the flocks and keeping those sheep tied up for 3 days or 3.5 days until they finally slaughtered it and put the blood on the doorposts. That's an in-your-face move if there ever was one. And to roast it the way we're supposed to roast it leaves no possibility that it's anything other than a sheep. It's quite obviously still in the form of the animal as it cooks. So imagine the scene as the Egyptians hear the bleating of the sheep that the Jews have taken and hitched up to posts, and the Egyptians are powerless to intervene. After 10 plagues, believe me, no one was going to start up with the Jews at this point. That's why the sheep had to be procured and then had to wait till the 4th day to emphasize who's really in charge, says the Chen Tov. If it were taken at the last minute, the Egyptians could say, well, it happened so fast, how could we didn't have time to intervene. And it also had to be a male animal and flawless, exactly the kind that the Egyptians worshipped in their temples. Because if it were any less, the Egyptians could simply excuse this renegade behavior as it's not specifically applicable to our kind of divine sheep. And there's a nice parenthetical note from the Zohar. Remember that God had told Avraham that his descendants would be in exile 400 years. and now we were going out after only 210. The Zohar supposes that the 4 days that the Jews held the lambs captive, they were in such terror that the Egyptians would put down this slave rebellion by force and kill all of us. This 4 days somehow completed the suffering of 400 years. That was our destiny. So this Paschal event served to elevate the Jews in our own eyes and in the eyes of the Egyptians. It was meant to emphasize that the God of the Jews, not Pharaoh or any other sub-deity, was real and true and enduring. It was meant to wean us off any inclination towards idolatry and to strike down plainly all that the Egyptians considered divine and powerful. And there's one more element that goes into the mix, which was circumcision. Any uncircumcised male Jews at this point had to have a bris milah before partaking of the Korban Pesach, before going out of Egypt. We know from Abraham's story that it takes 3 days to heal enough so that you can walk out of Egypt without too much pain. So the 3 days of waiting also provided the time for this to take place. And in that, we cover 2 dimensions of the Jewish consciousness, the rational and the meta-rational. All the psychology of self-image and separation from idolatry makes sense and is the basis for connecting to God in a rational, logical way. Bris milah, which we now do routinely at 8 days old, when a baby boy has no rational or logical faculties to determine on his own whether he wants to carry this tangible sign of the covenant. This indicates that our connection to God stands and really originates beyond the limits and parameters of reason. It's a bond that emanates from the essence of our being, our neshamas, our godly souls, which connect us all one to another, to Torah, and to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Throughout the remaining 600 or so mitzvot that we'll encounter in the rest of our Torah reading from now until Simchas Torah, each of those is possible for us because of that unbreakable, inseparable, inalienable soul that every Jew possesses. The mitzvot, from Korban Pesach to telling the story at the Seder to mezuzah, each form a link, a connection, a bond with Hashem, yet above the physical world of practical mitzvot, the fact of God's choosing us to be a mamleches kohanim v'goy kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, changed the essence of our being as individuals and as a nation forever. In these 3 parshios of Yetzias Mitzrayim, going out of Egypt this week, Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea next week, and Maimad Har Sinai, standing together like one person with one heart around Mount Sinai after that, we are at this time in the darkness of winter in Toronto, in the midst of COVID, connecting with our essential being as a free nation, eternal and able to sail above history, looking forward to the chapters of redemption that have yet to be written. Good Shabbos.